And thank you also for inviting me to speak this morning. I had a small rebellion when I was asked to do this talk, and I refused to talk about elderly patients because I'm getting older, and I thought that maybe I would call it in relation to mature patients. Because have you all found that the older you get, the younger elderly people are getting? And so I think my definition of an elderly person is somebody who's at least 25 years older than me. So within the new pharmacovigilance legislation, which you've heard a bit about this morning, we have a definition of a risk management system. And the important thing in that is that if you notice, it's a set of pharmacovigilance activities to identify, characterize, prevent, or minimize risks. And also an important part of the loop is to assess how effective your risk minimization activities have been. And because nobody but lawyers understands the words of a risk management system, we decided that we would have a useful definition and say that a risk management plan is the detailed description of a risk management system. So the basic components of a risk management plan, it's trying to answer three questions. What do we know about the drug at the time? What do we need to find out about the drug? And how are we going to minimize the risks? And that applies to whatever age group you are. So when we look at what we know about the drug, you have what's called a safety specification. To answer the questions of what do we need to find out about the drug, most of what you will have will be in the pharmacovigilance plan. But as the lawyers alluded to this morning, the new legislation also gives us the chance to ask for post-approval efficacy studies. Although I think that probably for the majority of drugs, this will be asked relatively rarely. And finally, the part which is probably of most interest to most of the audience here today is how are we going to minimize the risks? And for that, you have risk minimization measures in a risk minimization plan. So if we go back and try and focus which bits of the risk management plan can perhaps apply most to the more mature patients, the safety specification, and as I said, it is to identify what is known and probably more importantly, what is not known. And you can really take this into three categories. It's what's known about the drug, what do you know or not know about the target population, and about the disease that is being treated. And again, as colleagues have talked about extensively this morning, probably the most important things when you're looking at those in an elderly age group is to know a bit about the pharmacodynamics and the pharmacokinetics. You also need to know how will the drug be used and what is its adverse event profile, although I suspect that because in clinical trials you'll have had relatively few patients in older age groups exposed, you will probably have less of an idea what the adverse event profile in the elderly is. Class effects are probably much the same regardless of what age you are, but interactions are going to be of particular interest because, as again has been said a lot of times today, polypharmacy is a major occurrence in more elderly people. And when I say the level of confidence, what I'm thinking of here is how sure can we be that we've identified the adverse drug reactions. And I think, again, when you think about the more senior population, there's going to be so few exposed that you're really not going to have very much idea of what the specific adverse event profile in the medicine is going to be in that age group. When you're looking at the target population in the safety specification, you're really thinking about who was studied and, more importantly, who wasn't studied. Have you managed to identify particular risk factors in the population who will make a patient more inclined to have an adverse reaction? And what events can be expected in this population? That's really quite important because if you're trying to see if your medicine has an adverse cardiovascular effect, you need to know how many heart attacks you're going to expect in that age group of patients. And that is one of the problems that we have, is that we frequently do not do a good enough job of trying to see observed versus expected. And with the disease, Again, the natural history of a disease may be very different in an elderly population than it will be in a younger population. It's easy. If you think of something like breast cancer, it's much more unpleasant and more difficult disease to treat in someone who's age 30 than in someone who's age 70. And also, what events can you expect as part of a disease process? And maybe with an elderly population, what events they're going to have a lot of comorbidities. So what are the events that you're going to expect? So in the safety specification, the parts which are of particular relevance are going to be maybe the number of patients who have been studied in clinical trials. And this, in the safety specification, you should get a breakdown by age and by gender. And as we've seen in presentations before this, it tends to be a relatively very small proportion of patients studied who are, in fact, over the age of 65 and even fewer over the ages of 75 or 85. So if we're looking at patients not studied in clinical trials, although there will be patients with these various impairments, you're not going to have that many. And although these aren't age-specific, their prevalence increases with age. And so these are going to be important areas of missing information when you're looking at prescribing for your elderly population. And now in the new version of the risk management plan in good vigilance practices, we're particularly asking companies to consider when they're looking at the predictability of this in the safety specifications, to look at the effect of multiple impairments. Don't just look at one of them. Look at what the effect could be when you bring them all together. Look at multiple diseases and multiple medications. You might need, as Alpha's quite clearly said, we should perhaps be thinking about having particular laboratory screening, and also thinking about ADRs of special concern in the elderly. So from your safety specification, when you've looked at all these things, you're going to get what you know about the drug, which are the important identified risks. You'll also have the important potential risk, those where you have some information that they might occur, but you're not really sure if they are a true effect or not. And more importantly, you're going to have the important missing information. And these three sets of risks or lacking information make up what are your safety concerns. So when you have your safety concerns, the next stage is to consider how you're going to investigate that. And in your risk management plan, you have what's called a pharmacovigilance plan. And this may be a routine pharmacovigilance, the sort of thing that Georgi was talking about, where you collect your reports, you do signal detection, analysis. These are all the things that are required by law. And then you start getting the things that are much more of interest, particularly to pharmacoepidemiologists, the additional pharmacovigilance activities. But they cover not only observational studies, but you may need to have particular clinical trials. And I can quite see from how we've been talking this morning, but you may want to request particular pharmacokinetic studies in an elderly population, or maybe even some preclinical studies. But probably the thing that most concerns practicing clinicians is how you're going to prevent or minimize the risks. And for those, you have your routine risk minimization. And the reason they're called routine risk minimization is because, again, it's a legal requirement for all drugs. So you'll have the legal status, the pack size, importantly, what information that you have in the SPC or the package leaflet. And again, as we've emphasized, that maybe we are not doing perhaps quite as good a job as we could do in looking at this particular population. And also the labeling may be of importance, how the drug is kept in its packages, how it's presented, because this could be an important way of trying to avoid medication error in elderly people. But you will also maybe want to have particular additional risk minimization measures. And these are all the various measures that we have available for this, which I don't think really that I have time to go into today, unless you want to be here for a couple of hours, which I suspect you probably don't. So when we're thinking about specific considerations for risk management in the elderly, we should be thinking is, will age have a significant effect on the pharmacokinetics? And have enough patients been studied so that we know the answer to this question? And in most cases, I suspect it would be no. Is there a need for, so from that follows, do we need to have specific PK studies in older people? What is the effect on dose recommendations? Because when you do a study, it's only a particular use if you then apply what you found in a study. And it's not going to only be the effects on renal metabolism, but you're going to have differences in absorption. And as Dolores said, lipophilic effects of drugs will be different in the elderly. Is there a need for specific studies in your pharmacovigilance plan for the elderly? Well, we know there's going to be an increased risk of drug-drug interactions, but do you need to be doing additional studies to investigate this? And are any of the ADRs a specific concern in older people? Postural hypertension is pretty unpleasant at any age, but if you're in the elderly, it's going to be a particular risk, because if they fall, they're going to have a greater chance of doing a hell of a lot more damage. So do you need to have risk minimization that's particularly targeted to more elderly people? And also, I think we need to be particularly careful when we think about causes of medication error to make sure that we're considering this. So in conclusion, the risk management plan describes what is known and not known about the drug. It provides a platform for discussing how the things that aren't known or only known partially are going to be investigated in future, and what risk minimization activities are going to be put in place. Within the safety specification, specific parts are of particular relevance to the elderly, and we need to think very carefully which ADRs may be of particular cause of harm in the elderly. And we also may need to consider whether we should have specific risk minimization. Thank you very much.
Stella, thank you very much indeed. And I think you've really highlighted how risk management plans offer an important tool going forward, particularly in filling that gap of what we do not know in the elderly. Perhaps we've got time for just one question. Colleague on the right, thank you.
One adverse event to think about that is a little more subtle, that's not often considered, is the effect on appetite. Involuntary weight loss, especially in the setting of long-term care, can take place over a long period of time, and so relatively subtle changes in appetite may have a major effect on outcome.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you.